Spring 1942. Ivanovo Air Base, Russia. The bizarre aluminum machine perplexed Lieutenant Alexei Khlobystov as it was uncrated from its long journey across the globe. After 8 months of desperate defensive battles against the Luftwaffe, flying outdated I-16 fighters with round cowlings and traditional layouts, this strange American aircraft with its sleek lines, automobile-style doors, and propeller seemingly disconnected from its engine represented impossibility made metal. The P-39 Airacobra, rejected by the Western Allies for high-altitude combat, had arrived on the Eastern Front, where it would forge an unlikely legend. Across Soviet airfields that spring, 192 of these peculiar Bell aircraft would confront a reality that contradicted everything Soviet design philosophy had established about fighter construction. Soviet pilots discovered an aircraft where the engine sat behind the cockpit, connected to the propeller by a long drive shaft that ran between the pilot's legs. They found a fighter with a car-like door that opened sideways rather than a sliding canopy. Most remarkably, they encountered a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, a weapon 3 times larger than the standard 12.7mm machine guns mounted on most Soviet fighters. These technical curiosities, features that American and British pilots had largely rejected, would systematically transform the Soviet air war more effectively than any native aircraft program could manage in the desperate days of 1942. The mathematics of air power were being rewritten in aluminum and ammunition, in horsepower and cannon shells, revealing an American industrial capacity that would ultimately deliver 4,746 Aircobras to the Soviet Union, more than half of all P-39s ever built. What began as confusion at American engineering would evolve into complete tactical transformation. The Eastern Emergency had begun. The catastrophic losses during Operation Barbarossa in 1941 had decimated Soviet air power, with approximately 4,000 aircraft destroyed in the first week alone. These massive losses, combined with factory evacuations as German forces approached Moscow, left the Soviet Air Force in desperate need of fighters. Soviet production, disrupted by the relocation of factories beyond the Ural Mountains, could not meet demand. Native designs like the Lei GG3 were arriving in insufficient numbers and with disappointing performance. Into this crisis arrived the first shipments of P-39 Airacobras, part of the American Lend-Lease program. Soviet procurement officers had initially requested more famous American designs like the P-40 and P-47, but the Bell P-39 was available in quantity. Its rejection by American and British forces for high-altitude performance issues made large numbers available for Soviet use. According to military records, the first deliveries arrived via the treacherous Arctic convoys, braving German U-boats and bombers, to reach Murmansk. The ships unloaded crates containing partially disassembled fighters, accompanied by English-language technical manuals that few Soviet mechanics could read. Later shipments would arrive via the Alsib route, Alaska to Siberia, with American pilots delivering aircraft to Fairbanks, Alaska, where Soviet pilots would take over for the dangerous flight across Siberia. The systematic introduction of foreign aircraft to desperate Soviet squadrons began immediately, though its psychological impact would only be understood later. A Soviet air commander later testified to his superiors, "We expected American aircraft to be luxurious but militarily useless. Instead, the Airacobra offered capabilities our own aircraft lacked. This confusion about American engineering began our education." The first encounter with the P-39's unusual configuration shocked Soviet technicians. Unlike conventional fighters with engines mounted in the nose, the Airacobra's Allison V-1710 engine sat behind the cockpit, driving the propeller through a 10-foot shaft. This mid-engine design created space in the nose for the massive M4 37mm cannon and 2 synchronized 12.7mm Browning machine guns. Additional 7.62mm guns mounted in the wings completed the devastating armament package. Soviet test pilot Alexander Pokrishkin, who would later become the 3rd highest scoring Allied ace of the war, with 59 confirmed victories, initially approached the Airacobra with skepticism. The tricycle landing gear, with a nose wheel rather than the tail dragger configuration common to Soviet designs, seemed unnecessarily complex. The car-like door appeared fragile compared to sliding canopies. The absence of a second wing seemed to deny fundamental principles of Soviet aircraft design, which favored biplane and sesquiplane configurations well into the 1930s. Yet as Pokrishkin completed his first flight in the P-39, his assessment began to change. The excellent visibility from the bubble canopy, the responsive controls, and particularly the devastating firepower of the 37mm cannon, suggested combat potential that Soviet fighters couldn't match. His initial report noted, "The Amerikansky fighter climbs less impressively than our Yaks, but offers superior firepower and pilot visibility. Its potential for ground attack appears significant." When the aircraft was first demonstrated to a regiment of Soviet pilots near Moscow, their reaction captured the contradiction of Soviet expectations. The gleaming aluminum skin, the comfortable cockpit with leather seats and reliable heating system, the hydraulically operated landing gear. These features seemed to confirm prejudices about Americans prioritizing comfort over combat effectiveness. One pilot remarked, "They send us an air-conditioned flying restaurant while our men freeze in basic cockpits." Yet this dismissive attitude would soon face the undeniable arithmetic of combat. The P-39's 37mm cannon could destroy a German Bf-109 with a single hit, while Soviet fighters required multiple strikes with their smaller caliber weapons. The Airacobras' radio equipment functioned reliably, while Soviet communication systems frequently failed. Even the derided comfort features would prove critical during long patrols in the sub-zero temperatures of the Russian winter. The stage was set for an unprecedented transformation. Soviet tactical doctrine married to American engineering would produce an unlikely alliance that would help turn the air war on the Eastern Front. Summer 1942. Maintenance hangars of the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment. Soviet mechanics stared in bewilderment at the disassembled American fighter, surrounded by wooden crates stamped with English text and technical diagrams they could barely comprehend. The P-39's instruction manual might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. After years of maintaining simple, rugged Soviet designs built for ease of repair in field conditions, these mechanics confronted a completely alien philosophy of aircraft construction. One sergeant muttered to his comrades, "The Americans must have mechanics with 20 fingers and 3 university degrees." Across the Soviet Union that summer, hundreds of maintenance crews would struggle with the technical complexity of American aircraft design. They discovered electrical systems that required specialized tools, hydraulic landing gear that demanded precise adjustment, and an engine mounted behind the cockpit that seemed to defy conventional maintenance access. The P-39's unusual layout forced mechanics to develop entirely new maintenance protocols. The Allison V1710 engine required removal of the entire rear fuselage section for major servicing, a procedure that could take days compared to the few hours needed for engine work on a Yak-1. These maintenance challenges, procedures that American ground crews took for granted, would systematically test Soviet adaptation capabilities more rigorously than any previous foreign equipment integration. The mathematics of logistics were being recalculated in spare parts and maintenance hours, in technical translations and improvised solutions, revealing a growing flexibility in Soviet maintenance doctrine that would ultimately support over 250 air regiments operating Lend-Lease aircraft. What began as frustration at American complexity would evolve into complete technical assimilation. The assembly challenges intensified. Each Airacobra arrived partially disassembled in 7 large crates, requiring meticulous reconstruction using only the cryptic English manuals as guides. Soviet mechanics accustomed to working on Yak and Lag-G fighters with simple air-cooled engines now confronted the P-39's liquid-cooled Allison V1710 with its complex cooling system containing 14 gallons of ethylene glycol mixture. The glycol itself was in chronically short supply, with mechanics sometimes resorting to diluted vodka as substitute coolant during emergencies. According to Soviet maintenance records, the first assembled P-39s suffered numerous problems unrelated to combat. In the brutal Russian winter of 1942-43, temperatures reaching 40 degrees C caused starter failures, frozen control cables, and hydraulic system malfunctions. The American fighter had been designed for moderate climates, not the extreme conditions of the Eastern Front. Soviet mechanics improvised heating systems for overnight storage, wrapping engines in canvas tents with small stoves to prevent oil from congealing. The systematic adaptation to these American aircraft began immediately, though its strategic impact would only become apparent later. A Soviet logistics officer later reported to Moscow, "We expected American aircraft to be disposable, too complex to maintain in field conditions. Instead, we discovered that with proper procedures, the P-39's serviceability rate exceeded our native fighters. This revelation about American engineering reliability changed our maintenance doctrine permanently." The statistical context proved impossible to ignore. By late 1942, Soviet aircraft production remained severely compromised. The massive factory relocations beyond the Urals had disrupted manufacturing lines. While heroic efforts were gradually restoring production capacity, daily combat losses outpaced replacements. The Luftwaffe's experienced pilots claim multiple Soviet aircraft daily, with some German aces recording over 100 victories on the Eastern Front. Against this desperate backdrop, even the complex foreign fighters became essential to maintaining any semblance of air defense. Soviet production figures from late 1942 documented the shortfall. Monthly output of Yak-1 fighters, approximately 700 units. Lei GG-3 production, 320 monthly. Total 1942 production of all fighter types, approximately 9,800 aircraft. Luftwaffe strength on Eastern Front, 3,000 plus aircraft of all types. Estimated monthly Soviet aircraft losses, 900-100. These numbers published in internal military reports demonstrated that Soviet production alone could barely maintain existing squadrons, let alone build the air superiority needed for offensive operations. The turning point came in December 1942 during the Battle of Stalingrad. With Soviet air units critically short of fighters, freshly formed P-39 regiments were thrown into the desperate defense of the city. Despite maintenance difficulties and pilot unfamiliarity, the Airacobras contributed significantly to blunting Luftwaffe air superiority. The P-39's superior low-altitude performance, precisely where most Eastern Front combat occurred, proved unexpectedly valuable. While American and British pilots complained about the aircraft's poor high-altitude performance above 15,000 feet, Soviet combats typically occurred between 3,000 and 13,000 feet, exactly where the P-39 excelled. The first fully operational P-39 units formed under the command of experienced pilots like Alexander Pokrishkin, who recognized the aircraft's potential despite its foreign origin. Pokrishkin methodically developed tactics that maximized the Aerocobra's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. His 16th Guards Fighter Regiment began claiming impressive victory totals, challenging the notion that American aircraft were inferior to German designs. American technical representatives arrived at select Soviet airfields to assist with the transition. These civilian Bell aircraft employees, working through translators, helped establish maintenance protocols and train Soviet mechanics. Their presence created unusual scenes of cooperation. American technicians in civilian clothes working alongside Soviet military personnel, united against the common Nazi enemy despite vast ideological differences. Colonel Isaev of the Soviet Air Force initially rejected the American fighters for his elite regiment. After inspecting the aircraft's unusual configuration and hearing of maintenance difficulties, he declared, "I will not risk my pilots in these capitalist coffins." Yet 3 months later, after the same unit's first successful combat deployment of P-39s against Luftwaffe bombers near Kursk, Isaev would reluctantly admit, "Perhaps American engineers understand something about air combat after all. Their strange little fighter has teeth like a Siberian tiger." April 1943. Kuban River region, southern Russia. The unmistakable crack of the P-39's 37mm cannon echoed across the battlefield as Major Alexander Pokrishkin's Airacobra sliced through a formation of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas. Unlike the rhythmic chattering of machine guns common to air combat, each thunderous report of the massive cannon represented a potential kill. After months of refinement and adaptation, Soviet pilots had transformed their initial wariness into deadly proficiency. One cannon shell tore through the right wing of a German bomber, shearing it completely from the fuselage. The German aircraft spiraled helplessly earthward as Pokrishkin banked sharply to engage another target. Across the skies of the Eastern Front that spring, the distinctive silhouettes of P-39 Airacobras would challenge Luftwaffe air superiority more effectively than German intelligence had anticipated. Soviet pilots discovered that at altitudes below 15,000 feet, where most Eastern Front combat occurred, the P-39's handling characteristics were exceptional. They found that the aircraft's heavy nose-mounted cannon could destroy enemy aircraft with a single hit, unlike the multiple machine gun strikes required from other fighters. Most remarkably, they encountered an aircraft whose center of gravity allowed tighter turning radiuses at combat speeds than their previous mounts, enabling them to outmaneuver the vaunted Messerschmitt Bf-109G at low and medium altitudes. These combat advantages, capabilities that American and British pilots had largely overlooked in their focus on high-altitude performance, would systematically alter the balance of power in the skies more effectively than any single Soviet aircraft. The mathematics of air combat were being recalculated in cannon shells and turning circles, in climb rates and ammunition capacity, revealing a Soviet tactical innovation that transformed the rejected American fighter into the personal mount of the Soviet Union's highest-scoring aces. What began as grudging acceptance of foreign equipment would evolve into preferential treatment. The combat effectiveness became impossible to ignore. The P-39's heavy armament proved devastatingly effective against both German fighters and ground attack aircraft. The 37mm M4 cannon fired shells weighing approximately 1.3 pounds each, heavier than the grenades carried by infantry. A single hit could tear off a wing, destroy an engine, or completely separate a bomber's tail. German pilots soon learned to identify the distinctive silhouette of the Airacobra and approached with caution. According to Soviet combat records, by mid-1943, P-39 units were claiming victory rates significantly higher than those flying native Soviet designs. Pokrishkin's 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, equipped primarily with Airacobras, claimed 354 aerial victories between April and June 1943 alone. The regiment's success contributed to Pokrishkin's eventual total of 59 personal victories, making him the third highest scoring Allied ace of the entire war. The systematic evolution of Soviet tactics maximized the P-39's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Pokrishkin developed a vertical combat doctrine summarized as height, speed, maneuver, fire that played to the Airacobra's robust diving characteristics and powerful armament. Rather than engaging in prolonged turning battles, Pokrishkin taught his pilots to make slashing attacks from higher altitude, using the P-39's excellent visibility to spot targets, then diving with superior firepower before climbing back to safety. A Soviet fighter regiment commander later reported to Moscow, "We expected the American P-39 to be a poor substitute for our native designs. Instead, we discovered that when properly employed, it could dominate the battlefield." This revelation about tactical adaptation rather than technical specification changed our entire approach to air combat. The famous aces who emerged flying Airacobras created a mythos around the American fighter that contradicted its rejection by Western allies. Alexander Pokrishkin scored 48 of his 59 victories in the P-39. Grigory Rechkalov claimed 50 victories flying Airacobras. Nikolai Gulev achieved 36 of his 57 victories in the American fighter. These elite pilots, all awarded the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union, repeatedly chose the P-39 over available Soviet designs, even when newer Yak and La models became available. Their success reflected both the aircraft's capabilities and Soviet tactical innovations. The P-39's statistical comparison against German opposition revealed surprising advantages. Maximum speed at 13,000 feet, 368 mph, comparable to the Bf-109G's 386 mph. Armament: 1 37mm cannon, 2 12.7mm machine guns, 2 7.62mm machine guns, significantly outgunning the German fighter's single 20mm cannon and 2 7.92mm machine guns. Ammunition capacity: 30 rounds of 37mm, 200 rounds per heavy machine gun, allowing for multiple engagements without returning to base. Soviet modifications enhanced the fighter's performance for Eastern Front conditions. Maintenance crews removed the wing-mounted 7.62mm machine guns to reduce weight and improve roll rate. Ground crews developed field modifications to the oil system, preventing freezing in extreme winter conditions. Some units installed additional armor behind the pilot's seat, sacrificing some performance for improved survivability against German fighters that preferred stern attacks. The logistical challenges remained significant. The 37mm cannon shells required consistent supply from American factories, shipped across dangerous Arctic convoy routes. The specialized parts for the Allison engine couldn't be manufactured in Soviet facilities, requiring dedicated supply chains. Despite these challenges, by mid-1943, the P-39 had established itself as a crucial component of Soviet air power. April 15, 1943, over the Cuban bridgehead, demonstrated the Airacobras' decisive impact. Perplexed led a formation of 6 P-39s that encountered over 30 German aircraft, a mix of Bf-109 fighters escorting Ju-87 dive bombers. Despite being outnumbered 5-1, the Soviet formation attacked directly. Using his vertical combat tactics, Perplexed personally downed 5 German aircraft in this single engagement. His first victim, a Bf-109, disintegrated when struck by 37mm cannon fire. The remaining P-39 pilots claimed an additional 7 victories. This engagement, documented in both Soviet records and confirmed by German loss reports, demonstrated how the unusual American fighter had become the spear point of Soviet air counterattacks. After the battle, examining the wreckage of a Bf-109 destroyed by a single cannon shell, Perplexed reportedly told his mechanics, "The Americans built their fighter around this cannon. The rest is just a delivery system for bringing these shells to our targets. Once you understand this, you understand the Airacobra." Summer 1943, Bell Aircraft Factory, Buffalo, New York. American workers assembled P-39 Airacobras at a pace that seemed impossible just years earlier. The massive facility hummed with activity as aircraft took shape on the production line, one complete fighter emerging every 3 hours at peak efficiency. These workers, many of them women who had never worked in manufacturing before the war, built aircraft they would never fly, for pilots they would never meet, to fight in battles thousands of miles from American shores. Each completed P-39 destined for the Soviet Union received a Red Star insignia instead of the familiar American White Star, a small acknowledgement of its ultimate destination. Across the production floor that summer, the distinct shape of the Airacobra represented a profound engineering contradiction. American pilots largely rejected this same aircraft for its poor high-altitude performance and challenging handling characteristics. Test pilot Chuck Yeager later remarked, "It was a very unforgiving aircraft. If you made a mistake in a P-39, you paid with your life." Yet this same fighter, shipped across treacherous Arctic sea lanes and Siberian wilderness, would become the mount of choice for the Soviet Union's top aces. These manufacturing realities, the transformation of American engineering to Soviet combat success, would systematically demonstrate how cultural and tactical differences could completely redefine an aircraft's value. The mathematics of design were being recalculated through the lens of combat environment, tactical doctrine, and pilot expectations, revealing that aircraft effectiveness wasn't universal but contextual. What failed in one theater could excel in another. What began as an American rejection would evolve into Soviet embracement. The deep technical analysis revealed why this transformation occurred. The P-39's design prioritized low-altitude performance, with its supercharger optimized for elevations below 15,000 feet. American and British combat doctrine emphasized high-altitude interception and escort missions often conducted above 25,000 feet, where the Airacobra's performance deteriorated significantly. Soviet combat, by contrast, typically occurred between 3,000 to 13,000 feet, precisely where the P-39 delivered its best performance. According to engineering records, the P-39's unusual mid-engine configuration placed the heavy Allison V-1710 behind the pilot, connected to the propeller by a drive shaft that ran between the pilot's legs. This arrangement allowed the massive 37mm cannon to occupy the nose, providing unparalleled frontal firepower. American pilots considered this layout dangerous. If the aircraft crashed, the engine could crush the pilot from behind. Soviet pilots, accustomed to aircraft with minimal protection, considered the P-39's armor and overall ruggedness a significant improvement over their native designs. The systematic cultural differences in design philosophy became apparent in every aspect of the aircraft. American engineers prioritized pilot comfort with features like a car-like door, automobile-style instrument layout, and effective cockpit heating, luxuries absent from Soviet fighters designed for rapid production and mechanical simplicity. The P-39's hydraulic systems, electrical complexity, and maintenance requirements reflected American assumptions about technical skill and supply chain reliability that contradicted Soviet emphasis on battlefield repairability. A Soviet engineering officer later wrote in his evaluation, "The American P-39 reflects a fundamentally different understanding of a fighter aircraft's purpose. Soviet designers remove everything unnecessary to create machines that can be built and maintained under battlefield conditions. American engineers add systems to improve performance and pilot experience, assuming robust supply chains and technical support. Both approaches have merit, but in the context of the Eastern Front, we learn to appreciate the American philosophy's advantages while adapting to its challenges. The production statistics demonstrated America's industrial might. Bell Aircraft produced 9,558 Airacobras during the war, with approximately 4,546, nearly half of total production, delivered to the Soviet Union. Production rates reached their peak in 1943, with the Buffalo factory completing one P-39 every 3 hours on a 24-hour production schedule. A single month's output could equip multiple Soviet air regiments. This volume dwarfed German manufacturing capabilities, where Messerschmitt struggled to produce 300 Bf-109s monthly, despite desperate need. The supply chain logistics bordered on miraculous. Completed aircraft traveled by rail to Great Falls, Montana, where they entered the Alaska-Siberia (LSIB) ferry route. American pilots would fly the aircraft to Fairbanks, Alaska, where Soviet pilots took over, flying them across Siberia to the front, a 6,000-mile journey. Alternatively, crated aircraft would ship through Arctic convoys to Murmansk, braving German submarines and bombers, with a 15% loss rate considered acceptable. One way or another, thousands of American fighters made the journey to Soviet airfields. Soviet modifications transformed the P-39 to better suit Eastern Front conditions. Maintenance crews removed the wing-mounted 7.62 mm machine guns to improve roll rate and reduce weight. Ground crews installed additional armor behind the pilot's seat, sacrificing some performance for improved survivability. Winter operation kits developed by Soviet mechanics included oil dilution systems and engine preheaters to enable operation in temperatures reaching 40 degrees. Pilot testimonials consistently praised the aircraft's capabilities within its proper tactical context. Hero of the Soviet Union, Nikolai Gulayev stated, "The Airacobra forgave nothing, demanded everything, but rewarded skilled pilots with capabilities no other fighter offered." Alexander Pokrishkin, who scored 48 of his 59 victories in the P-39, wrote in his memoirs, "The cannon made the difference. German pilots feared the Airacobra because a single hit could destroy them. This created psychological advantage before the fight even began." The statistical comparison against German opposition revealed the P-39's strengths. While the Bf-109G held slight advantages in maximum speed and rate of climb, the Airacobra's superior low-altitude handling, heavier firepower, and better visibility provided critical advantages in actual combat conditions. The 37mm cannon outranged German weapons, allowing Soviet pilots to strike from beyond the effective range of German 20mm cannons. The P-39's all-around visibility, with its car-like side windows and bubble canopy, gave Soviet pilots situational awareness that German fighters, with their restrictive canopy framing, couldn't match. The symbolic significance transcended technical specifications. For Soviet pilots, the P-39 represented not just a weapon, but a glimpse of another world: American mass production, standardization, and technical sophistication. Every Airacobra delivered was exactly identical to the thousands before it, a level of manufacturing precision Soviet industry struggled to achieve. Each aircraft contained components and systems that seemed luxurious by Soviet standards: electric starter motors, hydraulic controls, effective cabin heating, radios that actually worked consistently. Captain Viktor Radkovich, returning from a successful mission over Kursk in July 1943, expressed the contradiction that defined the Airacobra's legacy. American pilots rejected this aircraft, yet we accomplished miracles with it. Perhaps this says more about pilots than planes. October 1944, Soviet Western Front headquarters. The statistical analysis spread across General Alexander Novikov's desk told an undeniable story. Soviet pilots flying American P-39 Airacobras had claimed 4,354 aerial victories against the Luftwaffe, representing nearly 30% of all Soviet air-to-air victories since the aircraft's introduction. After 30 months of continuous combat operations from Stalingrad to Kursk, to the current push toward Berlin, the American fighter, once deemed unsuitable by its creators, had become the personal mount of 14 of the Soviet Union's 30 top-scoring aces. The mathematics of aerial warfare had been calculated in aluminum and engine oil, in cannon shells and pilot blood, revealing an unexpected truth that military planners on both sides of the alliance had failed to anticipate. Across the battlefields of the Eastern Front that autumn, the distinctive shape of the Airacobra had become a symbol of Soviet air power's resurgence. The aircraft that began as an emergency stopgap had evolved into a preferred weapon system, with pilots actively competing for assignment to P-39 regiments. Combat records confirm that P-39 units consistently achieved higher victory-to-loss ratios than those equipped with native Soviet designs. The 16th Guards Fighter Regiment alone, with Pokrishkin leading his Airacobra pilots, had claimed 697 aerial victories by October 1944, making it the highest-scoring Soviet air unit of the entire war. These combat successes, achievements that contradicted pre-war assumptions about foreign equipment, would systematically force Soviet leadership to reconsider the importance of Lend-Lease contributions to their war effort. The impact of American aircraft extended far beyond simple numerical reinforcement. It had fundamentally influenced Soviet aerial tactics, maintenance procedures, and pilot expectations for aircraft performance. What began as desperate acceptance of foreign aid would evolve into genuine appreciation. The Battle of Kuban in spring 1943 represented the first major air operation where P-39 concentrations proved decisive. The Kuban air battles pitted Soviet air regiments, many equipped with Airacobras, against elite Luftwaffe units, including Jagdgeschwader 52, Germany's highest-scoring fighter wing. Over 2 months of intense combat, Soviet P-39 pilots claimed 216 aerial victories while establishing air superiority that enabled ground forces to secure the vital bridgehead. According to official Soviet records, the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 further demonstrated the Airacobra's impact. As German forces launched Operation Citadel, Luftwaffe units attempted to gain air superiority over the massive tank battle below. Soviet P-39 regiments played a crucial role in denying German air dominance. The P-39's exceptional low-altitude performance, exactly where the battle for Kursk was fought, allowed Soviet pilots to challenge the Bf-109G on equal terms. During the 49 days of the Kursk operation, Soviet pilots claimed 1,147 German aircraft destroyed, with P-39 units accounting for approximately 40% of these victories, despite representing less than 30% of available fighters. Famous aces flying Airacobras compiled extraordinary victory totals that contradicted Western assumptions about Soviet pilot quality. Alexander Pokrishkin, 59 total victories, 48 in P-39s. Grigory Rechkalov, 58 victories, 50 in P-39s. Dmitry Glinka, 50 victories, 41 in the American fighter. Nikolai Gulaev, 57 victories, 36 in Aircobras. These elite pilots, all awarded the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union, repeatedly chose to fly the P-39, even when newer Soviet designs became available, a testament to their confidence in the American fighter. The recognition and awards granted to P-39 pilots revealed the aircraft's significance. By war's end, 14 of the Soviet Union's 30 top aces had scored the majority of their victories in the Airacobra. The aircraft was featured prominently in Soviet propaganda, though carefully portrayed as representing Soviet-American cooperation rather than dependency. Photographs of Pokrishkin with his P-39 appeared in Soviet newspapers and magazines. The aircraft's red stars prominently displayed, while its American origin remained unmentioned in captions. Soviet leadership acknowledgement of Lend-Lease importance remained guarded during the war. In private communications with American representatives, Soviet officials expressed appreciation for P-39 deliveries. Marshal Alexander Novikov, commander of Soviet air forces, told American General Ira Eaker in 1944, "The Airacobra has played a significant role in our air defense, particularly in the hands of our best pilots." This private acknowledgement contrasted sharply with public statements emphasizing Soviet self-sufficiency. In a 1943 meeting with Roosevelt and Churchill at Tehran, Stalin briefly acknowledged American aircraft contributions, noting that Airacobras have proven useful in certain combat roles. This tepid public recognition represented the maximum Soviet leaders would concede while maintaining the narrative of Soviet industrial self-reliance. Behind closed doors, however, urgent requests for additional P-39 deliveries told the true story of the aircraft's value. The post-war Soviet minimization began almost immediately after victory. As Cold War tensions developed, Soviet historical accounts systematically downplayed Lend-Lease contributions, including the critical role of the P-39. Official histories published in the 1950s reduced American aircraft to footnotes, emphasizing indigenous Soviet designs while portraying Lend-Lease as merely supplemental. Pokrishkin's official biography, published in 1950, mentioned his American fighter only in passing, focusing instead on his tactical innovations without acknowledging the platform that enabled them. The American response to Soviet success with their rejected fighter ranged from surprise to skepticism. U.S. Army Air Forces officers initially disbelieved reports of Soviet success with the P-39, attributing claims to propaganda rather than actual performance. As evidence accumulated, including German confirmation of effective Airacobra units, American assessments shifted. A 1944 USAAF evaluation concluded, Soviet success with the P-39 appears to result from their employment of the aircraft at altitudes below 15,000 feet, precisely where our own testing showed the fighter performed adequately. Their combat environment and tactical doctrine have turned our cast-off into their champion. Comparative production figures highlighted the industrial disparity underlying the alliance. 1943-1944. Annual aircraft production. United States, 96,318 military aircraft. Soviet Union, 34,900 military aircraft. Germany, 24,807 military aircraft. These numbers, compiled from manufacturing records, demonstrated that American production alone exceeded the combined output of both Soviet Union and Germany. The 4,746 P-39s delivered to the Soviet Union, nearly half of all Airacobras built, represented less than 2 weeks of total American aircraft production at peak capacity, yet provided a crucial margin of air power on the Eastern Front. Air Marshal Alexander Pokryshkin, seated at his desk in Moscow in December 1944, concluded a confidential report to the Soviet High Command with words that captured the P-39's unexpected legacy. The American Airacobra, designed for a different war than the one its creators faced, found its true purpose in our hands on the Eastern Front. History often works through such ironies. May 1975. Kubinka Air Base, outside Moscow. Retired Colonel General Alexander Pokryshkin ran his weathered hand along the restored P-39 Airacobra, one of the few surviving examples in the Soviet Union. 3 decades after the war's end, the aircraft's distinctive shape, the mid-mounted engine, car-like door, tricycle landing gear, still evoked powerful memories for the legendary ace. "This American fighter," he told the young aviation cadets gathered around him, "taught us that effectiveness in combat depends not on where an aircraft is built, but on how it is used." After years of official Soviet histories minimizing foreign contributions to victory, Pokryshkin's candor represented a small crack in the ideological wall that had separated the wartime alliance from historical truth. Across Soviet aviation design bureaus in the post-war decades, the influence of the P-39 could be traced in technical decisions that contradicted pre-war Soviet doctrine. The placement of cannons in the nose rather than wings, improved cockpit visibility, attention to pilot ergonomics. These features appeared in successive generations of Soviet fighters. The La-9 and La-11, developed immediately after the war, adopted centrally mounted cannons firing through the propeller hub, abandoning the previous wing-mounted arrangement. Later, MiG designs incorporated bubble canopies with excellent all-around visibility, similar to the P-39's greenhouse cockpit. These technical lessons, influences that remained unacknowledged in official documents, would systematically shape Soviet fighter development for decades. The experience with American aircraft had demonstrated that pilot comfort wasn't merely a luxury, but contributed directly to combat effectiveness. The mathematics of aircraft design were permanently altered by the P-39 experience. Calculations now included factors like pilot visibility, ergonomics, and weapon placement that had previously been secondary considerations. What began as wartime necessity would evolve into lasting technical influence. Soviet engineers who had maintained P-39s during the war rose to prominent positions in the aviation industry, bringing their experiences with American design philosophy. The technical lessons learned extended beyond specific features to broader concepts. The P-39's emphasis on standardization, each aircraft identical to thousands of others, influenced Soviet manufacturing processes. American quality control methods, observed during the integration of Lend-Lease aircraft, gradually permeated Soviet production systems. According to aviation historians, the P-39 experience significantly influenced the development of the Yakovlev Yak-3, widely considered the Soviet Union's finest piston engine fighter. The Yak-3's excellent visibility, concentrated firepower, and emphasis on low-altitude performance all reflected lessons learned from the American fighter. Alexander Yakovlev, the aircraft's designer, had studied P-39 operations closely and incorporated several conceptual elements while maintaining a distinctly Soviet approach to structural simplicity. The cultural impact extended beyond technical specifications into Soviet views on technology. The experience with American aircraft created a generation of Soviet engineers and pilots who understood that effective weapon systems didn't need to follow a single design philosophy. The dogmatic adherence to Soviet design principles gave way to more pragmatic approaches. While Soviet aircraft remained distinct from Western designs, the absolute rejection of foreign concepts diminished. Veteran pilots provided the most powerful testimonials about the P-39's legacy. In a rare 1989 television interview, former ace Nikolai Gulayev stated, "The Airacobra demanded everything from a pilot but gave everything in return. It had no tolerance for mistakes but rewarded precision with capabilities no other fighter of its era could match. What we learned flying American fighters shaped our understanding of air combat permanently. As Soviet archives gradually opened following the Cold War's end, historical reassessment of Lend-Lease contributions became possible. Russian historians examining previously classified documents discovered the extent of the P-39's impact. Professor Alexander Kotelnikov of the Russian Academy of Sciences concluded in his 1992 study, "Without American aircraft deliveries, particularly the P-39 Airacobra, Soviet air forces would have struggled to achieve the air superiority necessary for major offensive operations between 1943 and 1945. This contribution, systematically minimized during the Soviet era, deserves proper recognition in our understanding of the Great Patriotic War." The statistical summary from newly accessible archives told an irrefutable story. Total P-39s delivered to Soviet Union, 4,746 aircraft. Percentage of all Soviet fighter strength at peak usage, 30%. Aerial victories claimed by Soviet Airacobra pilots, 4,954, based on Soviet records. Number of Hero of the Soviet Union awards to P-39 pilots, 80 plus. These numbers, compiled from military archives and unit histories, demonstrated that American fighters represented a crucial component of Soviet air power precisely when it was most needed, during the transition from desperate defense to strategic offense. The aircraft's symbolic transformation completed a remarkable journey. The P-39, rejected by its American creators as inadequate for Western Front combat, became a symbol of Soviet air power's resurgence. The fighter, initially accepted only out of desperate necessity, became the preferred mount of the Soviet Union's highest-scoring aces. The foreign design, initially viewed with suspicion, became so thoroughly integrated that its contributions could be erased from official histories without question for decades. This transformation reflected a broader historical pattern: how unexpected partnerships can produce outcomes neither partner could achieve alone. The American-built, Soviet-flown Airacobra represented a unique marriage of industrial capability and tactical application. American mass production methods created thousands of standardized fighters with capabilities that proved ideal for Eastern Front conditions. Soviet tactical innovations maximized these capabilities in ways American planners never envisioned. In a 2005 joint Russian-American aviation conference in Moscow, an elderly Soviet P-39 mechanic and an American Bell aircraft production worker, both in their 80s, met for the first time. Their conversation bridged decades of Cold War separation. The American asked, "Did our airplanes help?" The Russian veteran responded simply, "More than your country was ever told. More than my country would ever admit." Spring 1942, Ivanovo Air Base, Russia. The scene had come full circle. The strange aluminum machine that once perplexed Lieutenant Alexei Khlobystov had transformed both the war and the men who fought it. The P-39 Airacobra, rejected by the Western Allies for high-altitude combat, had found its true purpose on the Eastern Front, where its unique configuration proved ideally suited to the brutal air war being waged at lower altitudes. The aircraft, initially viewed with suspicion, became the preferred mount of Soviet aces who recognized its capabilities and adapted their tactics accordingly. The P-39's legacy extended far beyond victory tallies. It demonstrated how effectiveness depends not on theoretical specifications, but on practical application. How a fighter deemed inadequate in one context could become decisive in another. This lesson in contextual effectiveness would influence military aviation philosophy for decades. The final testament came from Alexander Pokryshkin himself, the legendary ace who scored 48 of his 59 victories in the American fighter. In his last interview before his death in 1985, he stated simply, "We expected an inadequate substitute for our aircraft. We discovered a fighter that changed how we fought the air war." The Airacobra's story reminds us that victory often comes from unexpected sources.